Hello, innovators. I am Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator. Today I'm talking with Lance Wantenaar, host of the Thinking Like a Genius podcast. Thank you for joining me on the Polymath Polycast.
Dustin, thank you very much for having me on the podcast. I know we've had our own discussions about various topics, and you've been on my podcast.
Yeah.
I'm actually very pleased and happy to be on your podcast because we've had some really in-depth discussions about a number of topics.
Yeah.
And we went quite deep into a lot of the discussions that we had. So I'm looking forward to this discussion.
For sure. And whenever I was on your show, I felt like I was actually able to express my polymathic tendencies. Whereas on other shows, even though I had great conversations, I had it limited to one or two areas of my interests. But I actually was able to get to all of them with you.
That was good. We dived in quite a lot of topics which were very, you could say, cross-reference in a lot of the fields.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something I found really interesting because of the pillars that you were talking about, how they were all connecting. I know we dived into various different discussions going from training into philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience and various other areas that we looked at.
Mm-hmm.
And tying all of this together was, for me, really valuable because it gave me a lot of very different insights, which was an enjoyable experience. And I think we got into a bit of a state of flow with our whole discussion.
Yeah, definitely. Hello and welcome to the Polymath Polycast interviews and discussions. And so one thing I'll have you do is please say hello to the innovators in the audience.
Innovators, hello, how are you? It's fantastic to be able to speak with you as a host or as a guest on the PolyCast. I'm looking forward to it and hoping to learn as much as possible from you.
From cybersecurity professional, philosophical psychologist, I would even say, and even online content creator, you have a lot of that going on. What got you started before all that, and what was your mindset?
Okay, I got started in this quite a long time ago. I was thinking a lot about this over the weekend and previously because I was wondering why I started going down this road. I've always had an interest in, you could say, wanting to be, I had this dream as a kid that I wanted to be as wise as possible because obviously, you know, you got references in the Bible to Solomon and wisdom and being able to make really valuable decisions and clear and concise decisions. And I think that kind of carried through until I became older and into adulthood, and then started reading up into various philosophical contexts and ideas. Mm-hmm. I started having an interest in Eastern and Asian principles with regards to Buddhism and also Zen Buddhism and also martial arts. And I also started looking into body language and reading about various things. I also started looking into IT and technology when I started studying, because I studied as an agricultural researcher and I worked in that for a while before I came to the UK. And I continued my education in IT, but then I still had a look into cybersecurity and hacking and that whole principle of investigating everything and finding how things work. And I think it's that principle of the curiosity of driving to see how systems work and why people have this drive to actually break into systems, to actually learn about them out of curiosity, because that's you could say, the driving factor behind cracking initially, but now it's known as hacking because of the, you could say, negative context to it. The whole purpose of original hackers was actually about knowledge acquisition, about learning, about investigating, finding how things work and understanding things. It was a curiosity thing. And I think that was a big driver for me.
Yeah. I think it's fantastic, and I resonate with a lot of it actually too, because a lot of my own path is quite similar too, where I spent a lot of time pursuing Eastern philosophies and even Western, just like yourself there. And I think that's fantastic how our paths really align in that way.
Yeah, it's interesting to have different aspects and different perspectives. I had a curiosity at one stage specifically about religion, and I made a choice to actually read the Quran to actually find out what the correlation is and how that is viewed and structured, and to get some insights. And I was quite honored to actually have a Quran because one of the guys I was working with gave me his personal copy, and it was quite an old copy. And I read through it, and as much as what I saw the similarities between the Bible and the Quran and some of the ideas and concepts, and you could say the historical context, I was very aware that this was his personal copy and it was a revered copy, and I was quite, you could say, relieved to actually give it back to him. But it did give me an additional insight into different perspectives, which is where I think a lot of my curiosity comes from, and why I decided to go down a lot of the more subsequent routes, which is where I started looking into marketing, philosophy, and also a lot more recently, a lot into psychology and neuroscience to actually understand myself a lot better, because I've always been aware of self-development in that aspect.
Yeah. One, I think that's something you would agree with, is that we both would want to strive to achieve the greatest mind that we could accomplish in our own selves. So we want to pursue the highest level. So even at a young age, I felt the same way, where I was like, how can I get the highest state of focus and the highest state of brain power, I guess you could say. I was thinking more of an energy and cognition sort of way rather than IQ. But I was trying to think about how can I be in my top gear every day, or at the very least most of the time, so I could accomplish the things I want to accomplish in the world. And so I think that you might resonate with that, which is probably why you created that Thinking Like a Genius podcast. What started that?
The purpose behind that was actually learning. I've had a podcast before, but it was in obstacle course racing. I enjoyed the process, and it forced me to actually learn in a different way. Because one of the things I did as I was researching into learning and how the brain works and the neuroscience and the cognitive side of things, I was looking at the various ways that you learn and process information. And when you start breaking it down, it's the various processes. Obviously, you're doing your reading, you're doing writing, which is the output from the reading, because now you're trying to process the information in a different way. The other way that you can actually learn is through doing, is physical experience, is trying to create something, produce something, experience something, or even create output. Now, there's multiple ways of creating output. It's through either video or podcast or audio. So the purpose for me of starting the podcast is to allow me to access various parts of the knowledge structure that I've created and to test the knowledge that I had. And it also is a way of actually building up capability and confidence in yourself, because public speaking is something where you have to learn it as a skill. And it's being able to feel confident and comfortable with your voice, because the big thing that I noticed when I first started doing the podcast and speaking is that I really hated the sound of my own voice. Because you've got that constant feedback, and you're very self-critical of your own tone, your voice, your timbre, and everything that you're producing in that way.
Do you know why that is?
I think it's a self-comfort thing.
Well, it comes down to the bone conduction. So when we speak, it vibrates through here. So our voices sound a little bit deeper to ourselves when we speak, versus when it's recorded, we don't hear the deepness that we normally hear. And so it sounds off to our ears when we listen back to a recording.
Oh, okay. So it comes down to, obviously, because you've got your myofascial structure and your bones and everything else, which connects up into your ear and your channels, your hearing channels. Okay, I didn't realize that. No.
Well, and it's interesting because that seems to be a challenge that everyone faces when they make content online, whether it's podcasts or video. I actually didn't make video for a long time. I started making podcasts way sooner because I could deal with the sound of my voice after a while, but I couldn't get used to being on camera like this.
I think the video creation side is for me a bit more challenging, because I'm not as creative as some other people, and I've not really had the time to actually be consistent about creating content on video. I think it's also something which you need to be quite consistent. You've got to have a clear structure of how you want to do and what you want to produce, and also being able to produce it in a really concise way, because that's the important thing, is to be able to create something which conveys a message in a really concise and focused way that's going to allow the audience to be able to utilize the information or to get value out of it. Because if you're just rambling, then it doesn't capture attention, it doesn't get a message across. And that's a really important part of it, is to be able to produce something that's clear and concise and valuable for the other person or your audience.
Well, yeah, exactly. And just a perfect example is this polycast right here. So at the beginning, I have a little template I make for myself now where I say,
Hmm.
hello, innovators, I'm so-and-so. I introduce the other guest on there so they know who they're listening to. And then we establish what you do. So host of Thinking Like a Genius and cybersecurity professional. And I say the name, thank you for joining me on the Polymath Polycast. And then we address the audience as the innovators in this one. And after that, I usually actually break the ice with something that I'll have you answer here in a second, is share something about yourself that no one knows about you. We actually went straight into it, so we kind of didn't need to do it, but I think it's an interesting icebreaker to help ease the tension in the air, so to speak.
Yeah, and it's a good way of doing it, because if you step into the other area which I'm involved in, which is social engineering, which of cybersecurity, one of the core requirements of social engineering is to understand human behavior and also the interaction between people, and making sure that you can use all of the parts of social engineering or social engagement to be able to interact with the person, to actually build the things like trust, rapport, if need be, use authority, and then use all of those aspects to engage with the person in such a way that they then follow what you say, or to provide you with information, or to find a way of actually getting access to systems, or to get the other person to take an action. And they rely inherently on not just social engagement and the whole process of social engagement, but also relies on the psychology of persuasion.
Mhm.
So if you look at books that Robert Cialdini wrote, which is the psychology of persuasion, then he pulls out the principles of persuasion in that. And those are very much interlinked to actually understand how people behave. And that ties into also thinking processes because of the psychology that goes with that. And then you've got all of the psychology which feeds into that to actually almost preload information, or actually manipulate the person to actually pay attention to things which you want them to.
Right.
So it's an interesting, you could say, intersect between all of the different areas, and to realize that they're all interconnected.
Well, and I think some people might listen to this and think persuasion and confuse it with manipulation, but it's not about manipulating anybody. It's more about
No.
conveying the information in the most accurate way, or the very, not accurate, ease of barriers to entry. So there's not as much barriers like, hey, who is this person that I'm listening to? What kind of things am I going to be getting out of this? And so when we structure it in that way, it decreases the barrier, so people can start clicking, okay, that's that person, okay, this is what we're talking about. Now I can actually focus on the subject at hand, not try to figure out, not spending brain power to figure out what are they talking about.
Yeah. And it's creating an expectation as well with the discussion, because as you start structuring the topic, and as you start feeding out information, and as you're discussing the information, you've got to make sure that you're discussing it in a way that you paying attention to what the other person would want to get out of it. But it's also making sure that you explain it in a way that's going to be congruent with everything that you're doing, because it's really important to make sure that everything is a consistent and cohesive message.
Let's talk about that real quick, because as a polymath, or aspiring polymath in my case, my show is based around being a polymathic person and having multiple different sub niches. And so because of that, there isn't much cohesion. There isn't much of a consistency, so to speak. I keep a consistent flow of how we talk, and that's why I worked really hard on having like a template of sorts and establishing some kind of ground. But considering the fact that the topics, like we, as you know from me being on your show, it can be flowing very much different ways. So what do you think about having that counterpoint?
I agree with the fact that you've got the different pillars and the areas and the disciplines that you're dealing with. But overall, if you take a look at the underlying topic, the underlying topic is being a polymath, is having disciplines in various areas and being able to find out more about those areas, or enhance knowledge, skills, and that, and then finding, you could say, connections between all of those areas, because that's how you relate information. That's how you build connections. That how it becomes relevant to you, because your focus is on developing all these areas as far as possible to get the best out of that knowledge structure, or that information pillar, or that emotional pillar, or it's whichever pillar that you're looking for, training pillar, a physical pillar, health pillar, psychology pillar.
So let's explain that for the audience just real quick, because the 4 pillars is the mind, body, spirit, and emotions. That's what we're referring to, the 4 major aspects of life. So in case you haven't heard of it before, that's what it is.
So when we take a look at the mind, body, spirit, the 4 pillars, now if you take a look at a topic in each one, we discussed swimming quite extensively in my interview, and we discussed breath holding, we discussed the form, the flow, how you start off, how you actually monitor the person that you're coaching, and actually taking them through that process, or they're guiding them through that process of how to develop the skill and making sure that the alignment is correct. And then if you step into breathing, we discuss breathing and how breathing actually impacts the body in a number of different levels. So it can actually affect how you can cope with stress and how you can actually improve your health with breathing. Now you've gone into the health pillar again, even though that you were still in the physical pillar. Now, if you take the health pillar, you can actually extrapolate that and start talking about stress responses, and then stepping into the other area of discussion, which we had, was about vagus nerve and nutrition and health and how that affects you cognitively. Now, what you've got is now you've got another connection. If you're stepping that into psychology, neuroscience, and something else, now you start talking about developing brain power. Now, if you're stepping into brain power and psychology, neuroscience, there's a bunch of connections in there. Although they are different pillars, you've got threads of connections between each of them, because your knowledge and your information structure is never singular. It's never just you've got this pillar of information that you're dealing with, this discipline that you're dealing with. It's never just that. So let's take, for instance, content creation where you're creating a video. You, in your interview, you've got your template. You created that because that's a structure. That's how you want to start up the process. You want to ease the person into becoming comfortable and actually allowing them to open up and actually build trust and rapport with that person. So yes, you've got a structure for actually starting the process of being creative. But now what you've done is you've started the whole psychology side of things, of engaging the person and actually allowing them to become comfortable by providing a piece of information that nobody knows. That allows them to actually start talking about themselves and actually start this whole discussion of engagement. Now, when you step into the other side, you can start talking about other topics. So although they're different topics overall, you are connecting them with various threads of information and you could say webs of information to tie them into a cohesive whole.
What I'm getting from you, Lance, is the breaking down of a branches, so kind of like a knowledge tree in a way. So you have the main pillar of the tree, the trunk, and then it branches out to different smaller branches and trees. And what's interesting is that there was an episode I had on the POLYCASTS with someone who we talked about knowledge as a forest of trees. Each of these areas that are deep of knowledge, and they break it down. So these pillars, like you're mentioning here, the 4 pillars, they have the breaking down components. You have the exercise and nutrition and how your health is. That's all part of the body pillar. You have the brain power and focus and mental fog, or mental clarity, I guess you could say. That's the mind pillar. And what you're saying is how they're connecting in those branches, it seems like.
Yeah. And it's developing, even though there's very distinct areas which you'll be working in, you'll always find there's connections with everything that you do. And that's what makes information really personal. That makes learning really personal, relevant to you, because the process of actually finding those connections and the relevance to you is how it enriches the information to you. You can take exactly the same information and give it to 2 different people, and each person will extract completely different perspectives out of that, even though it's the same information. And that comes down to a lot of different factors.
Let's go into the questions next. I think that's going to help us guide the rest of this conversation. So what are some negative habits or behaviors that you've repeated in your life that you wish you could or have overcome?
I had some repeated ones where I was making a lot of incorrect financial decisions. A lot of it was trying to get things up and going, also personal knowledge acquisition, trying to find a way of actually, you could say, solving problems. And in certain aspects, I made some incorrect decisions, which cost me quite dearly in that aspect. The other thing that I had is even though I was very aware that I had to improve my own personal health because I had a problem with eczema. I was eating foods, but I wasn't getting the benefit of the exercise that I was doing. I wasn't getting a change in my body composition. And I wasn't using the tools that were available to actually get the benefit out of it. And one of the principles that I had to take on board was to actually realize that I had to go down the route of measuring things. I had to become really persistent and consistent in actually measuring things and recording information to be able to give me that feedback of which way I was going. I wasn't making as consistent progress in the areas that I wanted to because I wasn't documenting what I was doing, and I wasn't getting that accurate feedback. Because one of the mistakes of using memory and remembering things, that you become selective in what you call based on what you think it was.
Yeah. What's interesting is that what you were mentioning there about exercise and making progress, it reminded me of my work as a personal trainer. I have a client who we don't track his data as much as I probably should. So I'm lacking as a personal trainer in that regard, but I've often relied on my memory. And I've done pretty well with him, but because of that, there's not enough data points to see his progress visually, like on a data graph or something like that.
Yeah.
And on myself too, I would even say.
Yeah. And that was, for me, one of the biggest lessons is actually going into that. I made a choice one year. I said, okay, fine. I was on holiday. We were in Barbados. It was a picture. We were on a catamaran out in the ocean. And I saw a picture of myself. Although I was training, I was reasonably slim. I was, you could say, what call skinny fat in that aspect. I wasn't defined in any way, shape, or form, even though I was training very regularly. And I saw the picture and just thought, okay, look, that's it. That was kind of a line under the sand. I decided, okay, this needed to change. And when I got back, I made a concerted effort of changing my diet, looking at everything that I was doing and making consistent choices on my nutrition to actually get to the next step of being able to become leaner, stronger, but also becoming, you could say, a lot more confident in myself, being able to get the body shape that I wanted to. And that ties into a number of things of getting positive feedback loop, making sure you're getting incremental changes, seeing the benefits of the changes, tracking what you're doing. Because now what you're doing is that you start realizing, I'm really not that good in remembering stuff. I'm really not as accurate. I was eating this and justifying it because I thought it was okay and that I was either eating enough calories or not enough calories. And I was basing it on perception and not accurate information.
Yeah.
And that's one of the key things.
Well, and just for example, too, I understand the whole concept of skinny fat is I'm trying to show on the video here is that I've always been very fit throughout my adult life because I worked swim instructor, personal trainer, that kind of thing. I've had the reason to have that background. However, at one point, my fat level was at 7%. I was a high octane athlete, as they would call it. And I was probably a teenager at that point, so like 19 or 20. And so what happened was, I got to that point, but I made no progress in muscle development. I was burning off all my muscle because I wasn't able to eat enough carbs. Now I've counteracted that and I eat too much carbs. And so knowing what I need to eat and knowing the nutrition behind it, I think is very important. And one thing you kind of alluded to too, was knowing the data behind it. And one thing I've been really interested in, you can bounce this off, is when to eat. When do you need to consume or recover, and knowing the timing, not only with your own digestive cycle, but also how quickly you need to eat after a workout to recover, that sort of thing.
That depends. I've been quite consistently doing intermittent fasting or doing fasting protocols for quite a long time. And the purpose was that is to push myself into a keto state, to actually burn fat and become leaner. And the purpose for that was basically to change body shape and to get to that point, because initially I was training, but I was eating the incorrect foods. By making sure that I was reducing the amount of carbs and then upping the amount of, obviously, vegetables, and I was eating meat at that stage, that allowed me to compensate for that. And I also changed how my body was actually using energy, because I was not training or eating after I was training. It meant that it was forcing my body to use whatever energy or fat was available, whichever energy stores were available. And that changes your body dynamic when it starts using more of the energy available, and you start becoming less dependent on eating to actually fuel yourself and using whatever energy is in your system.
Well, and the interesting is you're mentioning how you're still eating meats, but one thing I've come across is that depending on how much your metabolism is strong and how much you're consuming fats and carbs, the sugar levels are really hard to manage when you get into ketosis, as you know, but some people who are listening may not. And what I was told when I was doing my own research is the protein. And so a lot of times protein can actually turn into sugar. I'm going to screw up his name, but glucogenesis or something like that, where it converts the meat into sugar. And so a lot of people actually get out of ketosis because of that.
Yeah, I think it also depends. I think it depends on how much meat that you eat. If you start going, I know you get people are going to this really kind of carnivore-only diet or protein-only diet. It's each their own. I'm not going to say yes or no, it's good or bad, or whatever the purpose behind it. If it works for them and it works for them, that's fine. It's making sure that you've got a good balance, because at the end of the day, your body does need a certain amount of vegetables and nutrients and phytonutrients that are in vegetables. You can't get around it. Your body needs that for gut health and to be able to deal with a number of other reasons, because you've got vitamins and minerals and everything else in the vegetables that you eat. And if you're really consistent with the food that you eat, you're going to be consistent with the nutrition that you get, and it's going to make your body a lot more consistent in the way that it actually has to deal with the nutrition that it's getting. And it's making sure you've got enough variety, and because at the end of the day, the variety is actually good for the body. You can eat something consistently over a period of time, but if you start pushing it too much into one area, you can actually force your body to become food sensitive to it. And there have been cases, Dave Asprey has become sensitive to eggs because he decided to push the amount of eggs that he was eating at a given time. And now I think he's now sensitive to eggs, so he can't eat too many eggs. Really, he was almost exclusive eating eggs at one point. It's fine if you want to test that, but at the end of the day, I don't think it's a balanced approach to how you want to do things. And it's a problem, because when you start becoming really dependent on one type of food, you start becoming sensitive to it. You don't get the benefit out of the food, and if the quality of the food is poor, then you're going to start impacting your health. It's not just a single thing. You've also got to consider your body as a system. Yeah. It's not just you could say singular unit that functions in isolation. It's working on a number of different levels, and making sure that you're aware of how the choices that you make affect the system will change your focus quite dramatically. Because initially, when I started looking into it, I was looking at it in isolation. You've got to do this, you've got to do that. When you start stepping back and you start looking at it from a system point of view, it actually changes your focus quite a bit.
There's 2 points I want to make off of that there. Firstly, a lot of times I think of things in deficiencies. What am I deficient in? Do I need more water? Do I need more of this particular mineral or vitamin? But a lot of times people don't realize that. They lack energy to do exercise, for example. But oftentimes it may be just because they're lacking B vitamins, or they need to get some particular mineral like magnesium to get rid of their dehydration. And so what happens is it could just be one thing, but a lot of times it could be multiple things that you're deficient in. And proper nutrition will help alleviate that, but not being aware of each of those different subsystems of our body. Like we need the hydration, we need the mental focus, you need the physical energy, all of that coming together.
Yeah. And the other thing to take into consideration is once you start taking action, you can then start tracking the progress and see what the changes are. And the big thing is making sure you're taking action, making a decision, taking action, testing it, see if it works for you. Because each person is different.
Yeah. And one thing I'm really seeing from you, that this is an idea that's sprouting up, and I want to mention it before it goes away. It comes down to the learning and application of knowledge. So for example, we're talking about nutrition, we're talking about health, we're talking about the microbiome, which is a whole area of knowledge on its own, and then ketosis and all these different facets of exercise and the body pillar. And when you approach that learning of that, someone could teach you. A personal trainer could teach you the nutrition aspects. They could teach you the exercise and maybe some stretching, stuff like that. But they're going to be pretty isolated in one part of the body pillar. And a good personal trainer might even introduce you to ketosis or something like that. But it's different for each person too. And what might come down to is self-education. You have to teach yourself these various things, as you know very well. What I come to find interesting is that there's almost different stages. You have the basic level of knowledge. So someone who's getting a jack of all trades approach, where you have to know nutrition. You have to start eating protein after a workout. That's probably the first thing someone should work on when it comes to nutrition. So you have to recover after that intense activity, and you have to make sure you go push yourself in that workout. And then after that, it evolves into how can I optimize it? How can I start analyzing it? Like you're saying, the metrics. And then after that, executing differently.
Yeah. And it's this consistent you could say, approach it, you're building on other forms of knowledge and experience, and making sure that you allow for yourself to develop that knowledge over time and to be patient with it and taking the small steps. That's the most important thing for me, is making sure that you're focusing on being consistent and taking the small steps. I think there's a very big drive where people are talking about big gains and massive gains and all these big jumps in performance and capability. When you're starting out, it's very easy to see that big jump in capability and gains, because you're going from almost like a zero state to somebody that's actually training quite intensively and with focus and with energy and direction.
The term is called Newbie Gains, as they would say.
And there's a big, you could say, clamor for this, big gains thing and continue pushing. It's not bad to push and to challenge yourself.
Right.
That's a given. You've got to do that to actually get a performance increase. But don't be misconstrued to think that you'll always get the big gains, because it comes down to one of the principles, which I think we've discussed, is the Pareto principle, which is 80-20. You'll get 80% of your gains probably within if you're really paying attention to all of the factors that we were discussing within, you could say, the 80% rule. And then when you start getting into 20%, now you start getting into marginal gains. And marginal gains is a completely different game. It's a completely different way of doing things.
Well, there's marginal gains, there's big gains, and then there's also just the amount of how are you changing the intensity? So when you're going about your exercises, people talk about speed. They talk about how much weight you're lifting. And so when I started doing my own exercise, especially more consistently, and then started personal training, I came up with these 3 variables. And I say I came up with, but they're in personal training books too. They're in different words. A lot of people say them differently, but I think that saying it in this way breaks it down in a nice, unique format. The 3 variables of exercise: intensity, speed, and volume. How much are you doing and how long? How fast? Are you going to go for a more faster intensity or do slower and try to maximize the rep? Like we're talking about the Okinawa breathing method. That's more of a slower technique because you're obviously doing it for a much longer time. Same thing goes with lifting a weight, for example, isolating that muscle eccentric and concentrically. And then the intensity, which could be explosive workouts, so trying to go for a faster execution, or a heavier weight or something like that. And just understanding which variable are you focusing on that day. And one philosophy I really want to mention, just for safety reasons, is that you really don't want to change more than one variable at a time. Not in one workout, I mean. You don't want to do super fast and super heavy because it could lead to injury. A lot of people know that, but just saying it is very important.
Yeah. And the key thing to take in consideration, as you've mentioned, is making sure that you're doing it safely and paying attention to your body and how you actually feel, and making sure that you have a clear structure in place. I think the big thing for me was also the lack of structure and how I was approaching things. And if you don't have a plan, you're planning to fail. I know it's a maxim that's been used a lot, but it is quite true. Yeah. If you haven't got any kind of structure in place and you don't know the direction that you want to go and what you want to achieve, and you don't have any kind of clarity and focus on how you want to go about it, you end up just training for the sake of training. Yes, you're going to get a health benefit, but if you really want the, you could say, look and the feel and the positive feedbacks and all the other benefits, then you've really got to go according to structure. Structure is a key thing.
Well, what's interesting is it's at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, we obviously got to go on quarantine, that sort of thing, and go into the ideas of systems and habits. My workout system, and thereby the habits as well, revolved around me working at a gym, recreation center. And so when I stopped working, my habit for working out actually went away. It took me a couple of weeks to actually just work out again. And I think that's very interesting.
And you become dependent on that structure and that habit because that sustains you and makes it easier for you to actually cope with something. And it comes to habits because your habits are automations that you build into your life to make managing things on a day-to-day basis easier. And habits not a good or bad. It's just a way that your body and your brain automates things to make it easier for it, so that it doesn't have to continually think about the process and re-engineer the process on a day-to-day basis. Now, if you're looking at performance gains, that's a completely different story, because then you have to go down that whole route of conscious engineering to actually get the benefit. It's the same thing with learning. There's 2 ways of learning. You can do passive learning, just watching awareness, paying attention to the information, or you can do active learning to actually do conscious development of knowledge and skill to actually find specific items to draw out the information, actually draw out the relevance to you.
Oh, yes, I love that. So a perfect question here to kind of pivot into would be, what have you learned about learning and development?
The big thing is making sure that you have a clear idea of the knowledge and the information that you're after. Also taking time. Knowledge acquisition takes time, specifically if you want to develop it into a skill that you're going to benefit out of it for a long period of time, or that you're looking to find a way of actually improving an aspect of your life. There's a difference between reading a book for the sake of reading it out of interest and just for recreation, or reading a book to actually understand concepts and ideas and philosophies and principles.
Yeah. Well, and what do you think about how people's natural learning, for example, auditory versus visual, kinesthetic, or wanting to read the knowledge? Like, some people learn different ways. How does that approach into that system as well?
Use each one as it seems fit.
Okay.
I've used various forms. I've used audiobooks. I've used ebooks. I've physical books. I've got a mix of them both. I've now come to a method of actually using a mix of them. Although I've got quite a lot of physical books that I've read, although I enjoy reading a physical book, my knowledge transfer is a bit more, you could say, inconsistent. Although I bookmark them and I've got to go back and actually reread them, I'm now making sure I'm transferring to ebooks or information that's digital, because it means I can extract the information that I find relevant at the time.
Lance, it's remarkable how similar we are, because I actually can't stand physical books sometimes. I mean, you didn't say that per se, but I enjoy them. I enjoy reading physical books, but I often find that digital books have a much better feedback loop and mentally, and I am actually able to absorb it more. Just for example, there's a whole bunch of books on that bookshelf, and I've tried reading most of them, but I don't actually consistently sit down and read them over and over again. Whereas with the ebook, I can make a habit almost in a week now. Like, for example, I had a guest who had a book. I wanted to make sure I read that book before coming on, and I was able to read it consistently because it was an ebook. But if I had the physical copy, I probably wouldn't have read it. What do you think about that?
I think it's a different, I think for knowledge extraction, I think ebooks are a lot better. I think if it's the reading for the pleasure of reading, then a physical book is a different story, because the experience is different and it's just a different way of actually reading and processing the information. I like sometimes the look and feel of a book, because you're actually paging it, and it's a slower, more relaxed form of processing the information. I find that when I start processing it on an ebook, I've got it open, I'm highlighting stuff, I'm extracting stuff, I'm starting to find ways of actually summarizing the information or finding out what is the core principle that I'm looking for, and making sure that I'm getting that information out so that I can then take the information, crystallize it, and actually do something else with it and actually make it useful for myself.
Well, and Lance, this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is establishing the core idea, or the idea that you should focus on. Like, for example, at the start of the POLYCAST, we talked about the structure, and then trying to make that one idea, or in this case, multiple kind of cohesive ideas. What are we looking for mentally to focus on? And then I wanted to ask you too, since you seem to be the kind of person where we want to get more knowledge acquisition and progress. Do you find yourself reading for pleasure very often, or is it just purely like nonfiction?
It depends. If I'm on holiday, it'll be a mix of both.
Okay.
I tend to read. Sometimes I'll read books that I've had on my shelf for a while that I just want to page through and just out of interest, just to see if there's anything interesting out of there that I can actually then use at a later stage or reference back. There are some of the books which I read out of pleasure because I actually like the way that the author writes it. I love the Jack Reacher books because I like the way that the author has written the character, and how the character is actually quite systematic in his thinking and his approach and his analysis, and his whole mindset is what I like about it. I like a lot of those. And there's another series, I'm trying to think who the author is. It's the Charlie Parker series.
Okay.
It borders on thriller, you would say horror kind of things. It's a border between the two. It's kind of fiction thriller. He's an investigator. The backstory is his wife and his daughter got murdered, and he would basically, as a private investigator, hunted down the guy that actually did it. It borders on the supernatural side of things.
That's cool.
And it's a really interesting way. And some of the characters on there are absolutely hilarious. When you start talking about some of the Fulci brothers and two of these kind of cohorts in it. The one is a former CIA, the stereotypical, African-American guy who's really very cultured, very intelligent. And his partner is a, small white guy who's very erratic in his dress sense and he's very sloppy, but he's a really professional thief. And you've got these really interesting characters and this play between each other and how the characters all develop. So some of the books I just read because I enjoy reading them and they're interesting. And then sometimes the other books I just read because it might be a topic that I was interested in, or it's a book that I saw in the airport and I decided to buy it to actually read through it and actually just for a bit of recreational reading. So it comes, all sorts of courses in that regard.
Yeah, well, it comes back down to your curiosity too, I feel like.
Yeah, that probably ties into one of the other aspects of learning is curiosity and novelty.
Yeah.
Because those are the key things which you're looking for when you're actually learning, is because you're actually driving that thirst for knowledge specifically around an area. So that curiosity then also feeds into focus. And the focus then helps you to keep on track and to help you to focus on other areas and actually look for other areas to actually pull out the relevant knowledge to you.
So between focus, curiosity, knowledge acquisition, and learning as kind of the culmination of intelligence coming together, how can we, in your words, think like a genius then?
It's finding the information that's relevant to you.
Okay.
And actually finding ways of developing the information and making it personable. The other aspect is making sure that you're very open-minded, because your approach to how you actually ingest the knowledge, you've got to make sure that you don't have a preconception that you're using when you actually start the learning process. Because the big challenge is your biases and your belief systems will determine some of the areas that you'll be interested in or that you will not be interested in. And it comes down to how you process information. It comes down to a fundamental way that you see information that you will accept or reject based on your belief system and your cognitive biases and your personal experiences. So the whole thing is to make sure that you are willing to actually look at the information and find other relevance or lessons, or find a way that you can actually learn from that. And even if you can't learn from it immediately, find a way of actually paying attention to the information, potentially use it at a later stage. So it's basically seeing yourself as a library. You're acquiring knowledge for the sake of not just learning and making it personal, but also seeing whether it's something you can use at a later stage. Because knowledge can sometimes be almost like a library. Yeah. It's there until you actually think about using it, and then that comes back up.
That kind of alludes to a mental palace or mind palace, but one thing that was coming up to brain is that the cognitive bias, like you mentioned, is something that everybody faces. Everyone has some sort of bias, if not multiple, and trying to identify those and go around them, I think, is really important for growth. And that's one thing we learned too in one of my classes last year, is how to go about that. And I found myself having a cognitive bias, saying I don't need to learn this right now, and I need to get past that in order to grow. And I think that as hosts, we actually have to go past our didactic sense. I'm very didactic in a way, and I try not to be, because I know it can be annoying to people, because people can perceive you as a know-it-all or something like that. And as a host, I try very hard to active listen and not think about what I'm going to say next. Today is kind of hard about that because I was really excited and I started thinking about what I'm going to say next, but I still try to active listen. I'll even cover my mouth as a psychological trigger to stop myself from speaking and focus on what you're saying and try to ingest the information that you're providing. That way I can actually learn from it. So that's one great thing about having guests like you and all the other guests on the PolyCast, is that it can help expand your mind, not only the innovators in the audience, but myself as well, and the guest. And I think that I've definitely experienced that from guests over time.
Yeah. And I think the key thing is you've got to be willing to listen to the information in a way that's going to allow you to perceive the value out of it. When you listen to the information to look for value, it helps you to change your focus slightly, instead of trying to listen to the information to find whether you can judge it as valuable or not. Because as soon as you start judging information, it gets to the point where your biases and your belief systems actually kick in. And that's whether it's yes or no. That becomes binary in the way that you see it. When you start looking at how can I actually learn from the information, or what is the information telling me? Now what you're doing is that you're giving yourself an open avenue to actually explore the information as a point of interest. And that gives you the ability to then look for ways that you can actually connect it to something else. Because sometimes you can find the most unorthodox piece of information from an unorthodox source, and you can tie it back to something that's completely out of the ordinary. When we were talking about the sound of the voice, and the fact that you mentioned that the vibration down the jaw is something that gives you that additional feedback, and that's why it sounds so different. That's not something that I knew about, which is completely, it's not something that I never thought it would come up in a podcast episode.
Right. Just talking about breathing, for example, something I never thought would come up in a podcast episode, where something that I found as a teacher, teaching someone to focus on the exhale and maximizing their longevity with breath and try to stay calm, is something that you mentioned when I was on your show about the Okinawa method. And I didn't make that I didn't realize that other people could see the same thing I was seeing. You know what I mean? And so it's very interesting how we both kind of came up with this connection like that. And so one thing I also wanted to ask you too is, was this curiosity and interest the reason why you created your podcast?
It's part of it. Part of the reason for creating the podcast is actually to learn. It comes back to the learning process, because there's multiple ways of learning. You can actually learn by reading, learn by doing, experiencing, and that comes down to either physical or a specific exercise or a skill that you're developing. It could be something as, learning a skill like dancing. Dancing is actually a phenomenal skill to develop, because it gives you perspective, it gives you reaction time, it gives you judgment. You've got multidisciplinary balance, and you've got movement, you've got to integrate sound, you've got to integrate rhythm, you've got a number of factors that come into it. And it's a phenomenal skill to develop, because you not just exercising, but you've got the spatial challenge that you deal with on a day-to-day basis, especially when you're training. And when you start adding the steps and the rhythm, you've got all these multiple levels of complexity. Now you're learning on multiple levels when you're dancing. It's not just the physical movements and the steps and the counting and the focus, but you also got the music and the rhythm and the sound and the audio and the visual. So you've got so many different ways that you're actually learning in one package. So I think dancing is a phenomenal way of actually exercising, which is why people get so much benefit out of it, and why it feels so good, because you've got this whole experience that goes with that.
Well, and dancing often has a lot of similarities to martial arts in many ways. And one in particular that comes to mind is Bagua or Baguazhang, where it's circle walking. And so I actually learned about it through a kid's show called Avatar: The Last Airbender, which is a very fantastic show that I think literally anybody should watch. Have you seen it?
I think, I remember watching it, yes.
And so what's interesting is that all the movements in the show have been based off of real life martial arts. And airbending, one of the main forms on there, was based off of Bagua, where as an airbender, you want to be light on your feet and moving consistently and smoothly. And I took that idea. When I was a lifeguard, we had to work on the pool. And this pool deck could often be very wet and slippery all the time. And so you fall constantly when you're first getting started. But there was this skinny wall about a foot wide that's always covered in water, always slippery, that you had to walk down on multiple times a day or shift. And I found myself on many walls like that throughout the years. And when I'm walking down there, I often found myself stepping to the rhythm of a song that was playing on the radio, so dancing. Also following a Bagua movement where it was circle walking. I was combining them in a way. And I think because of that, it helped create a much more strong spatial awareness of where my body was and how I could move in this environment, but as well as balance. I was able to keep myself much more balanced on my toes versus having my heels down, because I have high arches anyways. I think it was just interesting kind of going off your idea there, where you have that one kind of practice that helps many different areas.
And it also displays one of the concepts I was talking about learning and actually finding connections. Although I watched the movie that you were talking about, I didn't make the connection of Bagua. Now, you've now connected that concept of the circular movement and applying it into your day-to-day life, and also tying in something about dancing. Now, these initially, when you looked at them, you would never have thought there would have been a connection between all three of them. You wouldn't have been able to force that connection, because you didn't have the position. You weren't in a position to actually start realizing that you could actually tie them together. It was only when you were in a situation you thought, I remember this, or I can do this, or I can do this, I can tie this together, I can actually do this to actually improve my own safety. and actually get a benefit out of it.
Right.
And that's a whole joy of learning. That's a process of learning, because you're taking pieces of information, making it contextual, and then getting some kind of benefit out of it and getting some kind of function out of it. I think that's a big thing. Is you mentioned it before, is that it's a quote that I use: knowledge is knowledge. Knowledge is not power. The application of knowledge is power. And the principle that you displayed over there is the application of knowledge. Mm-hmm. Even though they were in various different levels and spheres, you brought them into something cohesive, and you're able to apply the knowledge to get a benefit out of it. Mm-hmm. And that's a good display of actually learning. And that's something that people can do on a day-to-day basis, find these little relevant things and see. And it's also a good way of playing with information, because it gives you the ability to be creative, because now you can take something completely random and you can pull it into what you're doing on a day-to-day basis just to play with it and see if you can do something with it. Mm-hmm. And that's the ability of creativity.
Something I want to ask on that then, one note to make is that The Last Airbender is a TV show, not a movie, by the way. So you might want to check it out. It's really interesting, philosophical.
I'll have a look,
yeah, I'll send you a link, something like that. But it's very interesting. What kind of area have you been able to apply the knowledge in a unique way like that, where you're able to make connections in interdisciplinary formats or spheres coming together, as you said?
Spheres, for me, making the connections, there's quite a few of them. Initially, when I started studying psychology and looking at neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience, I was looking at them to actually understand how the brain processed information, how learning happened, how perception worked, how psychology worked, how those things affected you. And then I started looking into psychology, and I started seeing some reference of mental models and actually looking at mental models and how they were working. And then realizing that there was a cross-pollination between all of them, because the mental models, are they initially referring to a lot of cognitive biases? I look at mental models more structures of information similar to the pillars that you were talking about. You'll talk about or you'll use a mental model where you're developing a knowledge structure, say of psychology. I'll classify that as a mental model. And then under psychology, you'll have social psychology and various other psychology levels. But then you've got a mental model of philosophy, and you start looking at the various forms of philosophy and how that information is tied back to all of the other aspects. Now, when you go to persuasion, it ties back to psychology, but it actually ties to social engagement. Now, if I tie that back into another form, I started learning about social engineering to actually understand how psychology is working, but then I also started realizing that social engagement is tied to persuasion. And because persuasion had these principles that it was working on, it gave me a better understanding how social engagement happened and how social engineering worked. And that tied back into cybersecurity, because then I could relate the principles of engagement and social engineering and understanding some of the principles in that and how that actually functioned in cybersecurity and why social engineering was so effective and how phishing happens and how some of the fraud principles happens, because they relied on social engineering, but the social engineering relied on the engagement process. So it cross-pollinates once you start looking for connections and you start seeing threads coming across. And so there's a number of ones at which I've been able to pull out. And one of the other areas that I looked at is initially when I did the previous podcast, I was looking at the mammalian dive reflex, because when you doing an obstacle course race, one of the key things that they do, especially with the Tough Mudder ones, is that you were diving into an ice bath, or if it was a winter event, you end up going into freezing cold rivers. Now, that shock effect, I was trying to figure out what was causing that. And that's when I started looking into it and realizing mammalian dive reflex was talking about the vagus nerve. And I started getting curious about the vagus nerve. How did the vagus nerve work? How does it tie into the body? How does it tie into health? How does it tie into the heart? How does it tie into breathing? And then I started realizing, okay, these things are all interconnected. And I started getting curious about breathing. Now, breathing then it takes me back almost full circle to physiology, health, and I started getting really interested about, okay, if breathing is so key in actually being able to manage your physiology and actually manage your stress response with breathing, then I started realizing, but okay, if that happens, what happens with meditation? Then you start learning about how meditation actually improves focus. And it develops your focus and your cognitive ability, but it also helps you to develop and manage your stress and your mental wellness and mental health. So these things are all interconnected, but It was only when I started looking at these singular components and I started seeing connections, and I started looking at how do these tie together? Why were they tying together? How did they function? What is the system?
It's one thing that I'm really seeing there is that you put all 4 pillars in a nice cohesive package there. It came full circle. So you started out with the interest in the physiology. And so you had the body pillar as kind of the main response. And why is it affecting the body's response that way? What is the physical reactions? And then came down to the mental reactions as well, and how the vagus nerve was all connected. And so the mind and body connection has always been something that's very prevalent in people's minds. The one thing that people don't think about is the emotional response and how stress and panic makes you want to start changing the physiology subconsciously, the temperature of the body and how the body reacts to it. And then on top of that, meditation and how that develops the brain and bridges the conscious and subconscious minds. And so you had all 4 pillars coming together there. And you even, like you said, circle back around to the mind and body. I think it's very interesting. Yeah. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah. It's taken a while. It's been a long road to get there, but it's given me a huge amount of benefit in it, because it ties back into understanding how all of these systems tie into each other. And that allows me to better understand how I process information. Because now when I get an emotional response to something that happens, my awareness is so much better, because I know how my body reacts to it, and I know how I mentally react to it.
Yeah.
Because now I'm processing information on multiple levels, but initially it was quite conscious awareness of it. But now, because I've built in, you could say, the habits of this knowledge, I can very quickly and easily pick up on the triggers. I know we discussed triggers just before the podcast, and how you can actually look for triggers and actually find ways of putting a trigger in place, so you can actually change a habit or a process or a thought process, or even find a way of actually starting another process. And that's how I tie things together.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And kind of as a sequel to what I said on your show, when it comes down to swimming, something that I see as a trigger a lot is that the process of swimming is movement. It's not about breathing, it's about moving. But you need to breathe, and that adds a separate process to what you're already doing. So why I often teach my swimmers not to breathe. I teach them, don't worry about it for now, focus on the process of swimming. And the reason why is that when you're swimming, you're going to get to the point of panicking. You're going to get to the point of, hey, I need to breathe. But as I said on your show, it's not the fact that they need to breathe in. It's that they need to get rid of the CO2, the exhale, start that process. But there's a certain trigger that I often allude to some of my more advanced students right before that panic response. You're going to sense like, hey, I'm starting to lose my balance of air. I started to get all the oxygen, started the CO2, and you can start feeling that tension rise. It's not enough to make you panic, but you can notice it. And when I try to, as my own self-swimming too, see that trigger and start blowing out at that point before the panic sets in. Because once you start panicking, even if you already do the special technique that I'm referring to, that breathing out at that particular point, it's already kind of too late at that point. But if you can do it at the trigger, it's much more effective.
And that comes down to awareness, being able to focus on building awareness for it. But until you actually have the knowledge, and this becomes quite complex, because you can't do it unless you have the knowledge, and you can't have it unless you pay attention to it.
Yeah.
So it's a, you could say, loop that you're talking about. And sometimes because you're in that process, you don't always pay attention to it, and you're not always aware that it happens. You need a different or an outside perspective to be able to change your view on it, to actually get somebody to say, okay, look, you've got to do this.
Yeah, that's good reason to have a coach.
That's where coaches got multiple purposes. It's to give a different perspective, but it's also a way of structuring what you're doing to help you to get to an end result. So the purpose of the coach is quite valuable in that aspect.
And one thing we've been talking about a lot is loops and spheres, and how everything comes back to a beginning and end, and how they repeat a lot, and the systems often repeat a lot, and being able to be aware enough of those systems is very important. And I think that this show itself, the Polymath Polycast, one of the reasons why I like having people on is seeing how people like you are able to talk about their systems and think about the unique way. So when I choose a guest, I choose someone who's more polymathic like yourself, and be able to find, because I feel that polymathic people have more spheres and more loops to gain from and to pull from, as you would. And so one question I ask a lot of my guests then is, what is a polymath to you then?
Multidisciplinary.
Okay.
And being willing and able to put yourself in a position that you want to learn things outside of your comfort zone, but with the overall driver of how can it be relevant to you? Each person looks for information and experiences that are relevant to them. Some of it is initially quite selfish based on personal drivers, needs, and everything else. But you've got to find ways of actually developing those different spheres of knowledge and capability to find out how they can benefit you. And initially, it does feel like you're a jack of all trades. But over a period of time, I think for me especially, it started crystallizing into main areas. And that's come from either working in specific industries or being interested in sports and health or being interested in nutrition or being interested in things because I wanted to develop them on to enhance them. I think that the key thing is enhancing an area that you're interested in to a point where you start getting consistent value out of it. And it starts becoming, you get a lot of automation built in and skill and experience. And when you get to a point where you're getting consistently good with it, now what you can do is like, okay, I can focus on something else. Let's say focusing on podcasting, I want to become a creator. Now what you're doing is you're building up your skill to become a lot more consistent with your voice, with your breathing, with your presentation, with your personal awareness of speaking and conveying information in a clear and concise manner. So now what you're doing is you're developing a different skill. But when you tie it back to, say, developing skill in health, unless you're healthy, you don't have the quality of the breathing and the presentation and to have the energy of actually being able to present in a creative way, because it does take a lot of effort and preparation. And that's a skill development. And it's being able to consistently develop skill and realizing that each day that you focusing on doing a development in an area allows you to develop or take those principles and those skills and those capabilities into other areas. But it's making sure that you're willing enough to actually learn in those areas. And then over time, you'll start finding connections and bringing it back to your forest analogy. You've got the trees, you've got the trunks, but you've also got the roots, you've got the leaves, and you've got the interaction between all of them. And now what you're doing is you're creating an ecosystem of knowledge for yourself. And that's how I see it.
I'm going to cry. Oh man, every time I ask that question, it's just fantastic seeing what people say. And I think that the way you were able to bring things together too, you definitely took a polymathic approach to your answer to that question, I would say. And I think that's the beauty of that as well, where you're able to bring a lot of spheres of knowledge together, and the complexity of it was broken down because of the way you were able to explain it simply. So that comes down to the Feynman technique too. I was going to ask you, why do you think it's so difficult to learn in a multidisciplinary format then? Because a lot of people think, oh, I'm a specialist, I only need to focus on one thing. It's too hard to focus on just one thing. Why would I want to focus on many things and get distracted? So how can we break down the polymath in a learning sense going from the background up?
I'm going to step back a bit into the Feynman technique because it comes down to the principle of actually crystallizing the knowledge into principles. Because his process was that it's not just understanding what something is, but it's understanding the many complexity of what a piece of information is. I think his analogy was a bird. I'm trying to think which one, but it's you got in Japanese, in various different languages and cultures, you got different reference to the same bird. Mm-hmm. And it's actually taking that approach and actually seeing how can you change that perspective from different levels. The other aspect of Feynman is being able to boil it down into its key principles, really, really crystallize the knowledge into the most basic part of that information, so that when you actually take it, you need to be able to explain it to a child or to a 5-year-old, being able to crystallize it into a very, very clear, concise way to present it to somebody else. Because if you can't present it consistently and concisely to somebody else, it means that you don't understand it well enough to actually convey that message. And it's quite difficult when you explain something to children, because they will barrel off a bunch of questions and they can unravel your knowledge very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And it's a good way of actually testing to see if you really understand something, is to use a 5 why principle. Is like, ask yourself why a number of times and actually see at what point you become unstuck. Because now what you're doing is you're testing the core principles of that knowledge. if you understand it really well and it's relevant to you and you've got all the, you could say, the associative knowledge to support your understanding, you can then pivot and create an analogy of it. You can create a story of it, which allows many different levels of information to be processed at the same time. Stories are phenomenally interesting when you actually break them down into all of the different levels of information that they convey. Same thing with analogies. Your forest analogy is a good way of looking at it. It's an analogy of information. There's many ways that you can represent that, but because you applying that analogy to what how you think about it, it allows you to enhance it or change it or manipulate it in a way to allow you to convey the information to somebody else in an easy and a consistent way. That's the Feynman principle. Almost boil down into a concept, because you've taken something into your conceptual analogy and now you can take that and say to somebody, this is how it is. And now the person can look at it and it's like, conceptually I can understand it. Mm-hmm. I've got an overarching idea of what it is, and now I can dive into the nitty gritty. Being able to use that as a way of actually developing your knowledge, I think a really interesting principle about it all.
You were able to explain it simply, not only once, but in multiple different ways. I think that's a very prime example of being able to take a concept and be able to make it concise. Another analogy would be when I started teaching swimming, I was able to break it down to 3 steps, which I said on your show. And that came from being asked so many times, why do we do something like this? Why do we need to do this? And so when I broke it down to 3 steps, it makes it easier for children and adults to apply it in a more consistent format.
Yeah.
One thing that you have on your website as a goal is, how do we think better? That is a goal you had on there, a question you on there. How do we go about doing that?
That comes down to a number of factors. I know we've discussed health and psychology and nutrition and all kinds of various principles about it, but it's really understanding what your need is to think better. I think it comes down to your need. One of the guests that I had on my show is a chap called JJ Davey. He's in cybersecurity now, but he suffers from dyslexia and dyscalculia. So he struggles to read just in general, and being dyslexic obviously is challenging in itself, but dyscalculia means he also struggles with numbers. Oh, no. And the fact that he's in IT and cybersecurity, which means he has to not just read and process a vast amount of information, but he also has to deal with numbers quite often, makes it really, really difficult. And his principal goal was, how can I become smarter? How can I become better? How can I learn to actually make my life easier, to get value out of my life? And it's actually he took the personal responsibility of wanting to learn, wanting to change his life, and actually saying that it's not other people's fault that I'm not learning, it's my own fault. And that's my principle. My principle is to take the responsibility to learn. And sometimes it's going to be really difficult. You're going to be in a situation where you don't know any information and you are going to make mistakes. And to think better is developing those skills, the knowledge, the learning, all of these areas that I was talking about, because that allows you to think better, because you're actually enhancing your cognitive skill set and your mental skill set. I don't classify myself as somebody with a high IQ. I classify myself as somebody who is knowledgeable, who's been consistently working, improving his capability to be able to think better. And that allows me an edge, because it allows me to get a lot more value out of my life. And it also gives me personal satisfaction, because I'm getting benefit out of it. And to be able to change how I think and change my perspective has allowed me to look in all the various different areas and tie them together and actually get benefit out of it. Definitely. So it's looking at learning things like Feynman's principles, looking at other people to find out how I can learn, and actually making a decision of actually going outside of my comfort zone, actually doing something like the next focus that I'll probably look at is learning a musical instrument, because actually bringing in music into the whole scheme is a good way of actually changing how you think and learn, and becoming creative and actually carrying on with the learning aspect. And one of the areas that I looked at, where I found a correlation between all of the geniuses, between Da Vinci, Feynman, Einstein, is they all played music. They all had music in their life. And apparently music has got a massive benefit in actually cognitive development and also skill development, because that discipline of learning music transposes into other areas of actually learning and skill development, knowledge development.
That's wonderful. So you talk a lot about being able to acquire more knowledge, and not only that, but that person you were referring to being able to get past certain limitations they were imposed on naturally by life. Not life hit that person in the face, and he was able to get back up and push forward anyway. So he was able to adapt. And so one key question I actually really wanted to ask you is, how can we learn to adapt? Because they say Darwinian principle is the species who's most likely to adapt is the ones that are most likely to survive.
It comes down to mindset.
Okay.
And the core principle is realizing that it's a skill, and it's a skill that can be developed. And it's the willingness to be able to learn and taking responsibility for it. That's a key thing. There are two mindsets. There's a fixed mindset and a learning mindset. And it's work that Carol Dweck did. It's a psychologist in the US. There's a book that she wrote called, I think it's Mindset. But she did a lot of work on teenagers in the United States and had a look at some of them were a lot more successful than others throughout life, but also through their learning year. And it comes down to the fact that their core focus was actually learning and development and skill acquisition and finding a way of actually getting value out of what they're learning and being willing to realize that even though it's difficult, they're putting in effort to actually learn and to find ways of getting value out of what they're learning. It might just be short-term value to pass a grade, but if you start looking at it from a principle of what can I learn, how can I develop it, how can I work at it? Now, if you take an obvious example is, if you take a look at the amount of people in, I think in India, their work ethic is incredibly high when it comes to math, science, and education. They put in a lot of effort to it. And also the Asian communities, their key focus is about education and learning and developing and working really, really hard. They put in a lot of effort into learning and making sure that they work hard at it. Their work ethic is incredibly high. It's because they're not relying on talent. Talent is only a portion of it. 90% of the input that you get, it comes from effort. And effort will override talent in any given day because you're actually developing your skill set in a deliberate and a focused manner. And that's the key thing.
Well, and another example would be, I was actually reading a blog post by a woman who was saying in China, she was saying how she didn't realize when she discovered the word polymath that it existed. She didn't realize that she was already polymathic inherently. And she alluded to how in China, like you said, the education system is so pronounced and how people are focused on learning and development that they don't just focus on just one thing. They focus on the mathematics, they focus on sports, they focus on music, they focus on just other areas of skill acquisition like you're referring to. And that's one reason why these students do so well, is because they have that polymathic tendency, just society norm in a way, where they were able to develop that conscious connection because of that.
And that carries you through life, because that work ethic and that drive to be multidisciplinary allows you to become creative, because it allows you to use, might not be directly, but you come indirectly start becoming creative because you've got all of these different connections. You've built up all of this knowledge and you could say dendrites and nerve endings and everything else, and you've built up this muscle capability or this brain capability to develop this knowledge skill. It's like a library. It's creating those connections. Now in a later stage of life, you start realizing, how can I use this? Or this is tying in. You start making connections. Now, when you start getting to other aspects like state of flow, that can change things dramatically. Now, if you start focusing on developing states of flow, that gives you the ability to use your brain chemistry, your physiology, and your focus, and all of the other aspects of it to drive your knowledge acquisition, your creativity to another level. Now it will actually get your brain to actually start making connections automatically once you get out of those states of flow. And that's another really interesting area of research, which is, I think, going to have a massive impact on how people are going to be able to develop even further, because that area of science is now developing into an area which becomes a lot more clearly understood. And once it's quantified, it can start getting the benefit out of it, because you can start repeating the capability and start repeating the patterns.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that we've definitely established a lot of different patterns today in our conversation. And before we wrap up or anything like that, I wanted to kind of just mention there that as hosts, we talk about setting up the podcast or polycast ahead of time, having questions and having an idea of what we're going to talk about. So one thing I asked you before coming on is, what do you want to talk about on my show? And you're like, learning was one of the main things you mentioned on there. And so a lot of the questions that I made was geared towards that, because we want to talk more about learning, psychology, neuroscience. And even just in the last statement you were mentioning there, when you're answering the question, you had seeded the idea of neuroscience, which is something that we haven't actually talked much about today, which we probably should have. I'll have to have you on again so we can talk about that more deeply, talk about the myelin sacs when we're making strong connections or something like that, and the dendrites like you mentioned. Or another thing, you're talking about flow. So that's the seed that I'm going to water a bit here, because that's one thing I really want to mention, is that what is the state of flow in your words then, so people can understand it more?
Ooh, see, the state of flow is a really lovely area, which is, I'm going to refer to my notes on this because it's something I've looked at in a number of different ways. So state of flow is basically a brain state that you get in which you're very highly focused. There's high levels of focus and awareness, and it forces you to be in an open-minded, non-judgmental, capable state. So you're not using any of your prefrontal cortex to process information. That shuts down. It's called, hypofrontal, I'm trying to remember the term. But basically your prefrontal cortex, yes.
Yeah.
So basically your prefrontal cortex gets shuts down, and the rest of your brain starts becoming engaged in a state of flow. And that feeds in a number of brain chemicals, dopamine, norepinephrine, and a number of these brain chemicals which enhance your whole brain processing capability, because you're in a super focused, aware state of functioning in the now. And because you're highly aware and super focused, you're processing information on a completely non-judgmental level, which means that your connections that you're making between all of the different areas of your brain allows you to become highly creative, and you become super capable of doing things way outside of your ordinary capability, because you don't have that judgment barrier that restricts your capability.
Yeah. So I would answer the question too then. I think to add on to you is that in a philosophical way, it's almost as if you're getting into the flow of the Tao, as you would even say, or even getting rid of the ego, as a lot of the Greek philosophers would even point to. And so a lot of times when it comes to Stoicism too, it talks about what can you choose to accomplish on, and how can you react to something. And I think that flow is the optimal state of proactivity. So you're not thinking about how you're going to react. You're thinking about how I can get this task done most efficiently. And so going into the more scientific aspect, you're talking about the neurochemicals. I believe you said norepinephrine, and there's oxytocin. I think endorphins get kicked in, serotonin. They all come together. And that's one reason why when people get into flow, they actually get really tired afterwards, because it's kind of like a strong workout for the brain in a way, where you're using all the capabilities, but it eats it up, the energy resources.
Yeah. It's a massive drain on your hormones and all of the neurochemicals, because you're putting in so much effort into functioning in that super advanced state, is that you're burning up a massive amount of cognitive resources and brain resource to actually be in that state. And it's very, very demanding on your body's ability to be able to sustain that over a long period of time. When you actually step out of that, it's almost like your body is like, okay, I've dealt with that. I can now, I've now got to recover. And you normally find that when you get out of that state, you've really got to go through a recovery phase.
Well, and that's a good point to make. One thing I would even allude to is that it's almost like a turbocharge on a car, whereas normally we're on gas, but when you're in the flow, it's more like nitrous. And we were mentioning on your show, Tchaikovsky and Kotler, some people, main people on flow, but one I personally mentioned is Wilson Melancelli, who I've learned a lot from about flow. And one thing he talks about is the flow cycles and knowing your circadian rhythm, how that interacts with your flow cycle as well. So that comes down to sleep chronotypes, and if you're early bird or night owl, that makes a big difference. And, to maximize your recovery through your circadian rhythm and chronotype, as well as trying to make sure you actually focus on recovery and try not to work during that recovery phase, and trying to play hard, work hard, as they say. So you got to play hard during that phase and just relax and recover so that your next flow state isn't hindered in a way.
Yeah. And it's being aware that if you do push beyond that, you're going to get to a point where you can actually max yourself out. You're going to burn yourself out, and then you're going to be forced into a recovery stage.
Yeah.
So as you say, recovery is key to actually get to a point, because one of the other things that does happen is that when you push yourself in that position, you're actually pushing your capability on a edge of your current level.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you get to a point where you're recovering, when you do it again, you might have that small percentage of gain where you can go a bit harder and go a bit further and a bit faster.
Mm-hmm.
But when you do the recovery, it's really important that you give yourself that time to actually fuel up, get rested, recover. And the other thing that happens with your recovery period is that your connections between all of the various areas of your brain that you're processing while you're in that super flow state will carry on, and the positive feelings of being in a flow state will carry on, I think, for at least 24 hours afterwards.
Right.
Or if not longer.
So one thing I'm going to combine the next two questions, so I think they really kind of come together, is sports people talk about being in the zone. And some of the examples I can think of is video games and exercise have helped me get into flow. And even just in our last conversation and this conversation, we've got into the state of flow. At least I have in this one as well. I'm not sure about yourself, but I'm not thinking about what my roommate's doing or what people in the office are doing or whatever kind of distractions would happen. I'm focused purely on this. My entire brain is focused on that camera and the sound of your voice in these headphones. I'm in that state of flow, so I'm just constantly focused on that. How can we get into state of flow, and how can we use the flow for learning as well?
Okay, getting into state of flow, as you mentioned, is these circadian rhythms, and actually making sure that you're paying attention to your personal well-being to be able to be in a healthy state, to be able to allow you to get into a state of flow. The other aspects of state of flow is that it requires a certain amount of challenge for you to be challenged to a point where you're capable, but it's just outside of your reach. They quantified it down to about 4%. You need to be in 4% more than what you're doing at the moment. So if you're doing training or anything of that nature, if you know what your max rep is, or you know what your current capability is, making sure that you pushing it just a slight bit more, either do another repetition more, or maybe putting half a pound of weight more than what you normally would do, because you're doing an incremental stressor on your body. And that's the other key thing, is having a small incremental stressor which pushes you to go slightly harder, but not to the point where you're actually breaking yourself. And then making sure that it's novel and it's interesting, because flow state requires a lot of these brain chemicals. So it's got to be interesting, it's got to be novel, and it's got to be in a position where you really engaging in that, and you've got to be able to be shut off all distraction and be involved with it. Although it does help to have music for a lot of people, I find that music can be distracting for me. I prefer not to. Other people enjoy to have music because it means that they can shut off any kind of external distraction. They can just get on with the training. It's the same thing with learning. Some people will prefer to have loud music playing, either a singular song. I find that I can be in a state of flow just by playing classical music, because there's no vocals in it. It's just a consistent music. Yeah. And that allows me to be in a long state of constant focus. And then when it means is that I can continue follow various threads and learn and process information, and actually get into that rhythm of processing information with all the other triggers like novelty, a slight challenge to it, and being in that area where I can actually work where there's no distractions. So you need to either control your environment, or you've got to control your focus, because focus ties into novelty, into the dopamine, the norepinephrine, all of the other brain chemicals that trigger because of being in that state of flow, because they start cascading. And as you're adding more and more of each of these factors into it, they start building up into a point where you start getting really involved into it, which is what we've done with the interviews, because we've got headphones on, we're looking at each other, we're constantly feeding back on each other, and we're getting in that state of process. We're talking about various topics. They might not be just one topic. We're tying in a bunch of other aspects into it, and other topics into it, and points of interest, and sometimes something new pops up, like the last Airbender, or the Bagua. These are novelty triggers, and those are all tie into your pattern recognition, because now you start looking, oh, that's interesting, I can tie into that, and it builds into this whole process.
You talk about having a conducive environment. For example, in the middle of the interview, I had to pause and turn on the air conditioning because I was getting super distracted by the heat and I couldn't focus on you. Another example would be the novelties that all these conversations have taught me something new. And so the challenge of me active listening and not talking, I'm very talkative as a person. Someone who knows me in real life listened to one of my interviews and was dumbfounded by how much I was able to shut up, essentially, which I think is interesting to note, because when I'm talking to you, this is a challenging conversation for me. It's very exhilarating. I'm not complaining by any means, but I'm saying that you're talking about a lot of high level advanced concepts that I have to really process and think about, and being able to make the complexities and connections that we're referring to is a mental task. And I think that's what's getting me into that flows, because it's a challenge, as well as environment's conducive. I have nothing on my screens except for the notes and you. We had the headphones, like you said, so that way I could hear you more clearly. I'm focusing on the camera, exactly like you said. The other day, I actually had a test, a career personality test that I had to get done for somebody. And as soon as I got sent the test, my internet went down. So my natural environment was shot. I couldn't do it here, and I had to do it ASAP. Luckily, the public library, even during this time, was open. So I went there, and even though the library is still noisy, a lot of stuff going on, I had to put on binaural beats and music to cut out that environment so I could focus. And the intensity of the challenge, trying to make sure I get it done quickly for this person, as well as it's a test. It's already going to be challenging enough as it is. I was able to get into the state of flow because I was able to be a conducive environment and have that stress in a way.
Yeah, and those are just the triggers. The more you can add all of these triggers on top of each other, the easier it is to get into a state of flow and actually get you to help focus and actually be really involved with it. And because it's a whole engagement aspect as well. Because as you become more engaged, you start reacting to the situation a lot better. And that also allows you to start making connections between all the various areas that you're looking into. Because now what you're doing is that you try and find points of interest which come across, because sometimes a word can trigger something else, and you can bring that information into what you're talking about, what you're discussing.
And one thing, Lance, you were mentioning earlier was the music, the Mozart effect. And when the studies came out in recent years about that, they said that it wasn't very effective, or at the very least they were inconclusive. And so the Mozart effect, people thought if you listen to Mozart, specifically Mozart, it'll make you smarter or focus better. But the problem was, it wasn't about Mozart in particular, classical music in particular. It was what music you enjoyed. And classical music, like you said, has no vocals, at least most of it doesn't. And so it's easier to listen in the background without getting distracted by the words that are being sung. However, there is some songs, so some people prefer heavy metal as opposed to classical music to focus. And they're able to focus much more effectively because that's their kind of music they enjoy. There was a song from Kung Fu Panda, Oogway Ascends, which is essentially just a harmonic, really beautiful meditation song in the Kung Fu Panda trilogy, where Oogway, the main sage, is just his background track. And I love listening to that when I'm trying to meditate or focus. So I like you said, having it on repeat. I had that song on repeat the whole time I was taking that test. And it's a very instrumental, relaxing music. And between both of those two concepts, it came together.
Just getting back to music as a way of actually triggering and keeping in focus. I hadn't realized, but when I was talking about Jay, who's the chap that I interviewed with the dyslexia and dyscalculia, he found that binaural beats were really useful to him for staying in focus. I, on the other hand, find that I don't find that it gives me in that state of focus because it doesn't do it for me. It doesn't trigger those processes for me. And out of curiosity, I did a bit of research, and they found that people with ADHD or any kind of learning disabilities or anything of that nature find that binaural beats or that type of music or audio is for them a lot more beneficial than people who are classified as normal or don't have the different learning challenges that they have, or the brain patterns. They found people with ADHD or dyslexia that have a better response to that type of music than people who are classified as normal.
One thing I might have a counterpoint, just from my knowledge and experience, I could be wrong, is I think it also comes down to the particular type. Because binaural beats refer to more brainwaves. And so in order to find which one you prefer, you have to experiment. So I think theta is good for going to sleep. Beta is good for focus. And alpha is good for creativity. So when I listen to binaural beats, I often center towards alpha, not just creativity, but consciousness as well, just being aware of yourself. And so when I want to focus, I actually don't usually listen to the beta waves, even though that's usually normally the ones people do. I often listen to alpha waves to get me into a more conscious state, and that allows me to focus more effectively. I wonder if playing around with different wavelengths would make it more interesting for someone like you or someone who hasn't had the best experience with them in the past.
Well, definitely give that a try, because I've not tested to see if the different kind of music types or the brain waves that they're focusing will have a different reaction to me, because I've not played around with enough of it. I'll put it on the background, not really paid attention to it. But I think the more conscious approach is something that I will test to see if I can get a different reaction to it. But it comes down to making it personal and finding out what works for you. And that's the key thing, is making sure that you find something that works for you, and then kind of taking it further and then playing around with it.
And just as a resource to you and the audience, one of my favorite websites for binaural beats is mynoise.net. And there's a couple backslashes, noise machines, binaural brainwaves is the extension of the URL. But essentially, this website has these little knobs that allow you to change the power of various different beta or alpha or different channels, essentially hertz. And so I like to play around with it and find which one actually works best for me, which one sounds most appealing, at least at that particular moment, if not in general. And I think for me, 8 hertz usually helps me get into a state of focus, because I think that's alpha. It's usually what I focus on. I don't know if different volumes will change to hertz. I think it does in a way, but I usually try to go for 8 hertz, even if I change the volumes. And that, for me, that's what works. But I think this generator was really interesting. I wanted to share that.
Oh, cool. I'll have a look at that. I haven't played around with that enough to have a clear idea of which way it reacts for me, but I'll give that a try and see what reaction I'll get.
Well, and one thing we were kind of alluding to with flow is the supplementation of sorts. So there's a few things that we can mention. There's binaural beats, there's nootropics, which are mental supplements, and even biohacking. So what are your thoughts on those 3 areas?
Okay, biohacking, I do test that. I do play around with various forms of biohacking. I've done a sponsor of a Kickstarter project for Mendy, which is supposedly a neurofeedback device which they are bringing out, apparently supported with quite a lot of research. They've done quite a lot of testing with it already. I see there's a couple of devices that have come out which are down that road of things. So the Mendy device has been one of them which I'll test. I've tried a couple of others to get into states of flow, but I found that the technology wasn't up to it. I've also tested one for vagus nerve stimulation, because obviously vagus nerve stimulation is a good way of actually improving your health and immune response, and also heart rate variability. And I've tested various things to actually see whether they work for me or not, but I think it comes down to the quality of the technology.
Okay.
And at the moment, I'm still relying on some of the, you could say, physical reactions and some of the own things that I can develop myself, because it means that I'm not relying on a lot of the technology. But if there is something with regards to biohacking, I will test it, because I'm curious about it to see if I can get that next level of performance enhancement. It always comes down to a curiosity thing, but I think it's got to come down to what level of interest you've got in that area to see if it works for you, because there's a lot of levels of biohacking that you can go. And nootropics, I'm in 2 minds in nootropics. I think if you go for some of the kind of really more expensive chemical nootropics that you get, I found some of them tend to be quite harsh on my system, and the reaction is not that good. I think you've got to develop a good stack of them to understand which ones supplement each other, because if you take it incorrectly, it's almost like you're maxing out that a certain area of your capability. And although you get that benefit, I think some of the kind of harsher aspects of it can have a negative effect on it. So I've kind of eased off on some of the nootropics. I have tried lion's mane and a couple of other supplements, but I think I tend to downregulate on a lot of them very, very quickly. So I'm still experimenting with some of them. There are some of the basic ones which I will take, vitamin B supplements, vitamin B complexes. I tend to take as a consistent one.
We'll have to go ahead and wrap up here in a second. So I want to talk more about nootropics, but we're going to have to wait till next time because definitely going to have you back on here.
Yeah.
Yes. And when it comes to nootropics, just finishing that up there, what I find is that you have to have a support layer. You have to support the choline levels and vitamin levels, kind of like we talked about earlier, making sure you don't have any deficiencies. And then you can get to the more boosting cognition, focus, and memory. Now, as a wrap up, I like to ask, what do you think, whether it's cultivating curiosity or mindset or getting to the state of flow or thinking like a genius, what do you think could be the call to action for the audience today?
Call to action is to, one, be willing to learn. Two, I have got my own course, which I'm planning on launching soon. So, shameless plug over there. It's being able to introduce people to the concepts that support a lot of the research that I've done, and to be able to show people that it's a skill that can be developed. The call to action is to develop your own skill, to give you that capability of being the better version of yourself, to give you that capability of understanding yourself better and to become healthier and becoming a better, more resilient person, and to be able to provide value to yourself so you can become comfortable in yourself and to allow yourself to get to that next level, and to realize that each person is unique and they've got their own capability and they've got their own value, regardless of what conditions they're in and what background that they come from.
It's wonderful. I love that answer. And so I'll have links in the description, but where can people find you online?
You can find me on Twitter as Thinking Like a G is my Twitter handle. I've got a Facebook page for anybody that wants to stay on top of any of the information I post on there. And then obviously my blog and my podcast, which is the Thinking Like a Genius podcast, which are on all of the media channels. So you can find me on the main ones, which are iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and also I'm on Amazon and even Spotify.
Yeah. Spotify would be a main one now, considering its growth recently. So thank you for coming on to the show. I actually really enjoyed having you on, and it's just a challenge of being able to keep up with you. I think was really exhilarating too. So yeah, thanks for coming on.
It was a pleasure. Thanks a lot for everything. It was enjoyable to have this interview. And as I said, I learned a lot. There was a lot of new interesting stuff that's come out. Thanks a lot.